Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is the founder and formulator for Alfa Vedic and has traveled an eclectic path through athletics and academics in becoming a physician, kinesiologist, and functional movement specialist. He is a three-sport high school athlete and Division I scholarship football player, acknowledged for maintaining a 4.0 GPA in pre-law and pre-med undergraduate studies while competitive powerlifting. He has an MS in Social Psychology, MICP certification from Stanford Medical School with additional degrees in Oriental Medicine, Classical Homeopathy, Naturopathic Medicine, and Chiropractic. He is a Social Psychology Instructor, Paramedic-Firefighter, and owner-director of Integrative Medicine and Chief Clinician. He has a specialization in biological terrain medicine, clinical kinesiology, Japanese meridian therapy, endobiogenics, functional movement, craniopathy, and visceral manipulation. Welcome to the show, Dr. Barre Lando.
Thank you, Matthew.
You know, sometimes
Thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, sometimes I shorten bios, and I shortened it a little bit from where you got them. They're all recognized, accredited places. But I was like, you know what? You put in the work. You've gotten all of those certifications and degrees. I'm going to read them out. As it got hard, getting 3/4 of the way through. But man, what a background! It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm glad you're here. As we discussed briefly before we went on, that you're a little bit underground because your studies, I presume, have led to some very effective healing. And some of these things are healing things that, quote unquote, aren't supposed to be healed. And so you had to be a little bit on the hush hush. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, and what you're up to today?
Well, first off, thank you, Matthew, for having me here. I'm delighted because, recently I was made aware of your work and your site, and you've got all my favorite things all in one spot. Everything from athletics to spirituality and being on similar paths. As soon as I saw you there, I knew you were a kindred spirit. So it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, my bio that you read, that's all the outer trappings that I think people like to see these days because they like to see pieces of paper to legitimize somebody's background. But between you and I, those are the least important things. I think life experience, 40 years as a clinician, being in athletics, martial arts, especially the internal arts, that's where you really get to put information to experience, which then becomes knowing, because pieces of paper and book learning and schools, especially when a lot of the school that I had to go through just for my degrees, I ended up discarding. It was good because I learned terminology so that I could communicate effectively with colleagues and clients and that sort of thing. But the science and that sort of thing, as I was taught, after the fact, I realized was really not what I believed it to be initially, and really the world doesn't work like that. And when you start learning things through the internal arts and that sort of thing, then that becomes real knowledge, because you have to apply it in other ways, and then you have experiences and realize that no, knowledge does not come from books. And you're absolutely right. When during my clinical experience, when we had a lot of experience to help people with conditions that were considered irreversible and that sort of thing, and we had an international clientele and always practiced on private grounds. We had live-in units and a full multidisciplinary staff where we were able to help people with a lot of things. But what we learned along the way also is that our whole concept of disease is off in the first place. And in fact, there's been brilliant people that were my teachers that taught me a whole different taxonomy of pathology, with the understanding that it's really not pathology, but actually biological mechanisms working in our favor. And when you know the why and how those mechanisms work, then you work with them. And you also, the most important thing, you're free from the concepts of disease or the feeling that you're victimized by some external condition, because pathology or disease, as we think of it, is not, it does not exist in nature as an entity. Nature only has overriding patterns that provide the blueprints for everything. And when we self-create asymmetries in those patterns, because we have the free, the volition to do those sorts of things, that's the source of our problems. And then biology comes to our rescue and actually puts things right. But if you mistake it for something being wrong, then you're going to not be able to work with it effectively. And at worst, you're also going to impede what nature is trying to do. So we had great success with a lot of people, thousands of people, over a 40-year life or career span. And it was largely because we understood that disease does not exist the way we think it does. And a lot of the people that went full circle through different conditions and healed themselves, because I can't heal somebody else. Nobody can heal another individual. I always shied away from that, terminology healer, because it's really a misnomer. Somebody can only heal themselves because the forces that create the asymmetries, as we were mentioning, can only come within, so they have to be fixed from within. And somebody outside of ourselves or some medium outside of ourselves can't do it. Intelligent mediums and people can guide the process and facilitate, but they can't heal you. And they're only going to be temporary and limited at best until we finally come to the understanding. And this is what I witnessed with many heroic people that beat all these so-called incurable diseases, because I watched them bravely going through processes and understanding intuitively that the conventional treatments really weren't going to do it for them. And so they stood on their own 2 feet. And as a coach, I like to think of myself more as a coach. You watch the light bulbs come on in these people, and then they're free forever. They aren't in remission. They're free. And much more important than being free from a so-called disease, they're free from the fear and all the mindsets that go along with the concepts of disease in the first place.
Yeah, wow. Well, it seems like you're really bridging Eastern philosophy and Western medicine together with like biology and mindset, and combining them so that people can have a new view, as you've said, about disease and what they're experiencing. And I think that that's really important. My background more, looking at some of the work of like how the mind can cure different things. I definitely believe that we have the ability to cure whatever happens. Obviously, it doesn't happen 100%, but there are studies through Dr. Joe Dispenza's work where people are curing incurable things just through their minds, just through the power of their own consciousness. Now, you take that with more Eastern philosophies, perspectives, and modern medicine and what it can do in biology with a deeper understanding, I imagine that you get profound results. So there's a lot of questions I want to ask you. What would be the first step to healing, you think, for somebody who is experiencing some sort of, really challenging illness, like one of the serious ones? And also, I know that you also have created and have C-60, which is something that there's a lot of new information on. I was lucky enough to be connected with Max Champy from Live Longer Labs, a former NASA scientist, and he has C-60 also. And he said, not all of them are created the same, but that molecule, the C-60 molecule, is a very interesting and very important discovery. So I want to talk about that as well, because I only know a little bit from listening to him and some of the studies that have come out. But then I also, a few months later, heard of some other people putting out C-60, but they didn't have the same results and claims, and they went under a little bit of fire. So maybe you can explain that from your point of view, actually knowing the biology and the science behind it.
Sure. C-60 is interesting because we can use it to illustrate a lot of the concepts that would address some of your other questions. We live in a thought-based universe. And there's one gentleman who, better than anybody I know, bridged the gap between what we think of as metaphysics and science. And his name was Walter Russell. Now, Walter Russell not only discovered all the transuranium elements that he later gave to the scientific community and all the governments in the world, he lamented that decision later on, and he was friends with Tesla. In fact, there's a number of communications between him and Tesla that in the Walter Russell Institute, the University of Philosophy of Science, that are available and show a whole history that the public is not aware of. Walter Russell was held in great esteem by Tesla because they both understood the same thing. Now, when we say the universe is a thought-based universe, Walter would explain it, and this is demonstrable, by the way, the more you dive down this rabbit hole and work with the science. And the science we would loosely call waveform mechanics. And that's, I would say at this point in my life, it's my greatest passion, because it would explain everything and provide the solutions for every problem on this planet right now. So in reality, there's no substance in the universe. There's no motion. However, omnipresent, omniscient intelligence does exist, which has the ability to have ideas and then put those ideas into motion through desire and intent. And that we could explain as far as the overriding blueprint that we see that, creates everything around us that we see in what a lot of us would actually consider a simulation. And so as we have a thought, as a sentient being, which we are all individualizations, a coordinate in the overall consciousness, if you want to think of it that way, we have the ability to have ideas and thought. And if you think about it, if you just looked at all the creation on this planet, everything that's on it, all the civilizations that have come and gone, everything that exists presently, if there was never an idea, what would we have? We'd have a barren surface. So a lot of this is pretty common sense. Obviously, it all comes from blueprints provided by idea. But what Walter Russell, further helped us understand is how thought then becomes an electrical event, and it becomes a polarization, and then a polarization. And the more you get into the physics of it, you could explain the geometric phenomena, the lenses, the convexities and concavities and everything that bend those waveforms coming from the pure polarized thought. And every waveform has 18 dimensions that we have the ability to nuance in an unlimited amount of ways that create every variant within our own personal realities as well as the collective reality. So we are constantly creating every single moment. And we'll kind of draw that back to medicine in a moment. But let's just have a comment about C-60. If you think about the waveform model of reality, then you look at the periodic table of elements in a much different way. The periodic table of elements are not separate elements that are fixated forever as a separate, distinct personality in the material world. What they are is representations on a particular waveform that is always in transition. And when you take yourself out of the time-space continuum, which it's all of us have the ability to do that, then you would see that all of those elements will transition from one element to the other. And for instance, the elemental gold will become hydrogen, and hydrogen will become carbon, and so forth. Everything is cyclic. And in our mindset, based on time and space, those changes that are happening all the time within the earth, where those elements are in fact transitioning, it might take tens of thousands of years for one element to transition into another. Now, carbon-60, I'd say the precursor of a mainstream understanding of carbon-60 might be, good example that would be with, you might have heard of transitional elements that some people call ORM, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. Now, there's a soil scientist by the name of David Hudson, and I actually met with him right after his finding, where he discovered these elements in the soil. And when he concentrated them, learned how to extract them out of the soil, he found that they were present in the soil all the time. But when you concentrate them, they didn't behave like other elements. They could float, they could do all sorts of weird stuff that, defied, what we think of as the law of physics. But what they were, in fact, are these in between, not isotopes, that's a little bit of a different phenomena, but these elements in between the other elements. Now, if you look at the first element that on a polarization creates a coarse enough vibration that then registers to our sensory apparatus, as far as phenomena that we would consider physical in this simulation, we would understand that hydrogen is the first one that's around 30 some odd degrees right off the horizon of a waveform. And then all these things in between become this element that's described in the elemental chart, and all of them going up and down a waveform as we think about it. When you see a waveform in a textbook, in nature, these waveforms are actually three-dimensional spirals forever moving in a forward direction. But right in the peak of the waveform is carbon. And our simulation or reality, however you want to think of it, is made up of 9 different octaves, and each octave has different tonal fields. And so every element will jump through the octaves and through all the tonal fields of every octave, and each one of those tonal fields within the octaves is going to be one of the elements that we think of as the building blocks of materiality, which isn't material at all. And as some people have coined the term, the superstition of materialism. So carbon is at 90 degrees perpendicular from the equator of a waveform. And stop me if this is getting too gobbledygooky, but it's really the technical science behind it. And now in Oriental medicine, we would call that peak that carbon represents in that waveform as absolute yang. So it's fun because right now, a lot of the things that I originally learned way back in naturopathic college and so forth, originally I embraced them, and intuitively I felt there was something to it, but I didn't understand the physics of it at that time. So I had to just accept cultural terminologies that were appropriate for a different time and a different place. And I kind of liked them because they were a little bit on the exotic side and everything. That was fun. But I really wanted to understand more than just having metaphors that really didn't satisfy my left brain, my more analytical side. And I think what Walter Russell provided was the missing link, because when I was practicing, and I know you do the same, some of the internal arts and the martial arts, that sort of thing, and meditation practices and Qigong, your brain's always fighting with you. And, your heart knows the truth, but then you have this little onboard navigation system that won't shut up. And so what Walter Russell did is he provided the analytical data that is very logical and demonstrable, so that the analytical side can now become one with the heart. And when I say heart, I mean the real organ that should be considered our real brain. And of course, when I talk about heart and brain, I'm talking about more the emotional and mental plane, which is different than the physical organ, which is just kind of a piece of meat, and a simulation or a fractal step down of what the mental plane represents. So that's not where thought and feeling resides, but they play a certain role in our physical simulation. So Walter Russell provided that link, so now we can be a little bit less schizophrenic and have a unification of heart and mind. And for me, it was very useful as a practitioner, because I was able to take my old learning and the metaphors that I learned in studying the Shan Han Lun, and which is a Bible of Chinese medicine, and some of the other real scientific treatises from other cultures, but using different terminologies. And now all of a sudden they made sense. And now when you can make sense and merge some of the good things that Western science has come up with, now you can be more pragmatic in your clinical approach, and you can get better results, and you can have a nice merging of East and West, and have true integrative medicine. I really don't like the term alternative, and a lot of alternative that's going on these days is what I would call green allopathy, which is doing things less toxically and talking about holistic concepts, which is a good step in the right direction. But then going back to waveform mechanics, if we don't understand that our own thought is the origin of everything in our reality without exception, and then we just go down to the half of the creation cycle that's compressing data that then is registered in our material senses, we're not going to ever get off the wheel, and we're just going to trade one crutch for the other, although an alternative crutch absolutely has more of an ability to be less of a trap and eventually lead you to the next stepping stone. So carbon-60 represents a very special form of carbon, a transitionary form, I believe. This is just my belief system, but it's borne out in practical experience and research that it has very special effects, and it's why Buckminster Fuller was very excited about it when he made the original discovery. And it's a very young substance. And if you want to stay robust and vital in this simulation, then you want to have every cell of your body polarized, maintaining a powerful electrical charge. And when you take people that are on the ropes with a condition, as they think of it, or through the aging process, basically what's happening, the cells of the body are like worn out batteries. And that's why a lot of our therapies, especially with chronic degenerative conditions, we take great lengths to repolarize the cells. And there's a number of ways to do that. And one of the ways is with technologies. There are technologies now like pulsed electromagnetic frequencies that can very effectively repolarize the cells. And what that means on an electrical sense is to prolate. You have, imagine a sphere that's created with electrical forces. You have an east-west polarity and a north-south. Now, if you can maintain a positive outlook on life, free of lower energy center emotions, and come from doing everything you do with in a state of unconditional love, and do it with a joyous attitude, your souls will never depolarize, and you'll even need less and less sleep and less food. So when we do things that we don't enjoy, when we don't unconditionally love, then that is the real cause of sickness. and the real cause of depolarization. And that's what necessitates people like myself coming along and trying to coach people, not trying to, I don't in any way try to be a spiritual guru or that kind of thing, because that's over my pay grade. But what I do try to do is coach people in lifestyle and with the techniques that I've learned so that they can regenerate their cells from the inside out using mediums as long as possible, but then not becoming dependent on them and realizing that they're the source in the first place. So that's why I believe, and my mission statement from this point onward is to hopefully imagine into existence medical schools that are not teaching from a materialistic textbook, but the perfect balance of teaching people, students from day one, how the universe really works, what our role in it really is, so that we never fall into these mindsets that create all of our problems in the first place. And again, C-60 has, in my experience, the largest potential to kind of buoy up, to reprolate or repolarize the cells on that level to maintain the north-south axis, which is straight vertical, and to maintain the nice spherical symmetries that will maintain, robust health in a physical simulation. That's why carbon is the backbone of the particular octave that humanity presently resides, which is that fifth octave. And of course, we have the ability to jump octaves whenever the light bulbs come on. And carbon 60 can help support that. But one danger, like with any other physical medium, is to start to think that that is going to be the end all or the thing that's going to cure everybody. So carbon 60 can be a wonderful adjunct to our inner work and to help widen our window of opportunity until we do get the big idea, and and then we can throw away the carbon 60 too. Now carbon 60 is also if you take it back to a molecular level that most of the research has been confined to, because that's, chemical assays and laboratory experiments are pretty much operating on that level, which is fine. I love those kinds of studies myself, even though they don't get into the waveform mechanics, which I believe are what we should really be paying attention to. They show that it, lengthens telomeres, DNA and everything, and really kind of reverse a lot of the damage that's done by some of the things we're exposed to on the planet these days. And but we really have to realize most of the damage that's done to our bodies, it really comes from our own belief systems. And we could take gallons of C-60, and until we change our mind, we're going to be, just temporary with our results. But it's a wonderful substance. The one, I'll be quiet in a second. The last comment I'd make about C-60 is that, like any other medicine, when you get more advanced in your understanding of applying these things in a clinical setting, you always want to strive for balance. Now, as I already mentioned, C-60 is very yang. It's the most yang substance on the periodic table. And therefore, you want to be judicious in its use and understand the ecosystem, the body that you're giving it to, so that you don't create an imbalance with just that alone. You want to take other measures that will provide more of a balance to that absolute yang waveform that C-60 provides. C60 gets a lot of good results in many people, and I even see it. My dog takes it, and you know, it's just done unbelievable things I could tell you about, and we all notice the results. And that's because most of us are depolarized and need repolarization, but it's still possible to create asymmetry with it if you don't know how to use it, especially in the long term. And if you're playing herbal medicine and that sort of thing, you always want to make sure you're providing formulas that will be balanced so that you're not just getting temporary effects that in the long run might actually prove to be like whipping a tired horse and, you know, only gets you so far. So like anything, you're going to get more results with a tool if you're a skilled in the use of that tool versus just saying, oh, this is going to fix everything. So, please.
Wow. Yeah, well, you covered a lot there, and I really appreciate you going deep into the scientific understanding, because I know that it's kind of came out of nowhere. You know, C60, I didn't hear about it at all. Then all of a sudden I started hearing about it all over the place. And the only reference I really had was Max Champ, who's a former NASA scientist. And some of the studies he was sharing, I believe his mother had Alzheimer's. Is that what it was? And it was helping with Alzheimer's and really intense benefits. So, you know, and I think I really like your analogy of it, is that you need to know how to use the tool, and it's not the tool, it's not a cure-all. There's many other elements to health and understanding and vitality, and you've impressed upon a few times that thought is the godfather of this whole entire thing. If understanding your own consciousness, your own well-being. There's a lot of different ways that I want to go with this now that it's kind of opened up, because you know, my quest, and I think yours too, I look at your website, and you're back in the day playing football, kicking butt. You're getting a 4.0 GPA while powerlifting. And so you and I have probably that same mindset, is how do I use my body to the maximum ability? You know, when you're powerlifting, it's how do I lift 1 more pound? How do I lift 10 more pounds? What technique can I use to get better? And I think that in the personal development space, in the health space, it's like, how do we use what we know about consciousness in the world to create the most ideal life if you're on that route? Now, you can look at it from an entrepreneurship perspective, where it's like make 10K a month or 30K or 50K or whatever it is, living your passion. But it's really important you understand what that direction is. And a lot of people could use a little bit more time figuring out that direction, just taking time contemplating what they would really want to have that total human experience, like that peak experience, because it's not just money. That's going to be one part of it. That's going to give you freedom. There are all these different elements. So what I want to throw back at you in a very convoluted way is if you can talk a little bit about, like, you know, some of the benefits you've seen using C60, because I know for some people it'll be the first time of them hearing it, so they have no idea what it is. Some of the benefits and compelling research that you've seen. 2, you talked about the strategies and techniques for overall health. So I'm just curious, what do you recommend for total human optimization to live as vibrantly as possible? Some of the things that you teach, because I know that there's one side that there's health, and I want to kind of chat about that a little bit if you're really bunged up and you want to come over to the health side. But I'm curious for myself, people are going into, you know, microdosing and psychedelics and things like that. So I was curious if you could touch on all of that to the best of your ability.
Okay. That's a lot.
Yeah, no, I just throw it at you and then see what you can pick out.
Yeah. Well, it's all my favorite stuff. You know, I was telling you earlier before we went live here that basically I've spent most of my life in dojos and gyms, and I really think I've learned more there than in all the schools I've attended. And that's because when you use your own body and really challenge it, you learn about potentials that physically inactive people never get to experience. You know, it's funny, in my final years of football, I always approached every season very scientifically, you know, and my buddies on the team were, just off doing what college kids do. I was in the library, studying up on anatomy, physiology. I was reading the nutrition books put out by the very first naturopaths of the day that were popular. This is back in the 60s and early 70s. Pavo Rolas and all those guys, the pioneers, Paul C. Bragg. And, I was really intrigued by all this. But I would put everything on paper because I really understood that the power of just kind of getting it down into a very concise thought form, for me, I learned early on, seemed to really work. And a curious thing happened, as I approached every season all the way through high school and college, and I did my preseason training for whatever sport, and I'd always have predictable results and kind of carry the more momentum going forward to the following year. But then as I got a little more mature, what would happen is I'd get things down on paper, and then all of a sudden my body would just start instantly morphing into what would have in previous years taken me a few months in the gym or out on the track running or whatever. And I kind of made a little connection like, wow, I think a lot of this is going on internally, and it's good to follow through with all the training and everything because it really locks in your neurology so that you own it. But I really was starting to understand by using my body as a laboratory that this is really about your mind, maybe more than anything. And now after watching countless numbers of clients that I had the privilege to oversee their process with what they were going through, I have no doubt, because the magic really happens again when you coach them and provide the kind of medicine that I would deliver. But then the big changes would happen when they really started looking at themselves differently, looking at their role in the world differently, losing levels of fear and all the other things that kept them locked into practices and forms of medicine that were really impeding not only their ability to get better physically, but also impeding their progress at this level of the soul. And I'm a big believer that medicine, like the original Pythagoreans who coined the term physician in the first place, it was considered a very sacred act to guide people in this process. And they knew and really went to great lengths to work with the people that they treated to help them understand that all healing comes from within and not from external mediums. So go ahead.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I think for me, the martial arts background really helped with that idea in the first place, that our thoughts influence our reality. So I was curious because, of my background and just my own selfish desires. Can you provide that specific process in how you would do that for football? Would you see your body change and be able to adapt to the plays or what you wanted to do physically? Like, how would that look? Because I have a little bit of a process for skateboarding and athletes and also business people, and I'll add these different elements and help them create that clear structure. But I would love to hear yours to see if there's anything that I'm missing or can add on.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a reproducible technique, but I would live, eat, and breathe every single moment of the waking day, just visualizing what I wanted to achieve. Really not understanding that as a technique or something I read in a book or a guru taught me, but I just had an inclination to get a little obsessive about things. I don't know if you call it healthy or not. And, and then I put in my time physically too. I was out running at the track and training, and always was the strongest guy on the team, and, could win weightlifting meets at the same time and all that sort of thing. And it wasn't so much uh, performing athletically to win trophies or anything, but it was more just pushing the envelope to see how far I could go. And then there's those, so there was that. And I, in hindsight, I realized, well, I was pretty singular in my focus when I wanted to do something. And I also applied that to my studies. When I was in my last year of eligibility in college, I was already had my undergraduate degree in pre-law and pre-med, and I was already in graduate school in psychology. So, and I don't say that pretentiously that I was a smart guy or anything, but I just kind of had that obsessiveness, and which allowed me to, excel academically. And so I'd say first off, I don't know if to answer your question, but just to get your mind around exactly what you want to do. And for me, it was helpful to get it on paper, because then I had like an architect's blueprint, and I would stare at it. Every day I'd look at it, and then every day I'd act on it, whether it was a training technique, whether it told me, okay, today I'm supposed to go run 440s at the track, or hit the gym in weights, or after I gave up football, it was like, okay, this time of the day I'm doing my forms or hitting the bags, or doing more internal practices, that sort of thing. So that's what my technique was. And I think, again, in hindsight, the reason for all that is so that through my own experience with my own body, I could then apply that into healthcare and maybe have less doubt than somebody who just went through conventional studies, medical studies, and then applied a recipe, whether conventional or alternative medicine, and really try to bring all the pieces together, including spending a lot of time talking to people and really helping people put the therapy, whatever it was, into a larger context of, look, I'm coaching, we're giving you tools, and here's how they will work the best for you. Now, most people would still be in hopes that they're seeing somebody that could help fix them. But I tended, and as a practitioner, you attract the type of people that are ready to hear what you're saying. And so I did have the luxury of having the cream of the crop, so to speak, which came to me and were ready for that message. And rather than having people on 20-minute time slots and that sort of thing, I developed a system in my clinic that allowed me to oversee things and oversee a team where we could do comprehensive therapies, but then I was also allowed to spend ample time with people, and even, be willing to spend after-hour time on the telephone or in person or what have you, just to sit around and shoot the breeze and philosophize and, whatever it took just to kind of create that overall spirit of things. Going back to sports, the other thing I'd say that you really can't explain logically, but when you're in the middle of a game, and I used to actually experience this more in baseball. Baseball is actually my favorite sport. And for some reason, I chose football, to get me through college. And I'd say it's my one regret in life because I love baseball more. But baseball, there's a lot of different kinds of things going on, as far as just the things that come together to create those little magic moments. And when you just get, athletes always call it the zone, and it really is, but you just lose all sense of time and space. And then these unbelievable things happen that after you just go, wow, that was so cool. I can't believe that happened. And, that's what really brought it all together and made all the training and all the other things that you go through. And, you push yourself pretty hard when you go into, advanced athletics. And I played on a good level college team. You know, we're nationally ranked and all that kind of stuff. So we played the best of the best, and most of the guys all ended up NFL and so forth. So, you know, it allowed me to really test my mettle against good people. And then even in football games, just times where there's no time left on the clock and, you know, all hope is lost. And then just this freak thing would happen, and then you end up winning. And you know, those are just those really cool times. And I really think sports and athletic training, martial arts training, because you're taking your physicality within the simulation, pushing it to the limits. And with team sports, I like both team and solo sports. I really appreciate martial arts because it's just me. But then team sports, it was fun to get in this collective consciousness in those moments where those special times would happen. And then you had these people, you know, and we'd come together, we'd live with each other, we'd party with each other, people of from all cultures and races and walks of life. And, you know, it was just the perfect equal playing field where you didn't see anything other than each other's humanities and appreciate each other for who you were. And you really enjoy special moments. So again, I'm speaking as an old jock, but I learned a lot through training, you know, physically. You might need to rein me in a little bit. I think I got away from your question.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That was great. Well, what I really loved was your answer and just saying that you wrote it down and then you became obsessive. There's no magic formula in that. You know, there's a lot of great studies and evidence and education on the law of attraction and positive mental attitude and all of those types of things and affirmations. But if you just boil it down to figuring out what it is that you want, so it's clear, you can understand it. You know what I mean? This is exactly where I'm going. And then, you know, you went obsessive with it, and you maybe don't need to go obsessive, but if you put an 80% effort in, or your 100% effort, if it's something that's inspiring to you, you're going to put in your 100% effort. And there was a podcast recently done with Tony Robbins and Conor McGregor, and Conor McGregor was very well known for calling how he was going to win, talking about the law of attraction. He wasn't giving a lesson, but he was like, I'm visualizing my shots. This is the way it's going to go. And he did have some losses, but in the podcast, he talked about how he would go to the store and he would imagine what he was going to buy. He would imagine the cars he's going to drive. And he actually lived it and had 100% belief before he got there. He was very, very clear in his vision. And he even talked about being a two-weight champion before even entering the UFC, which I think had never been done before. I'm pretty sure he's the first two-weight champ in the UFC, which is absolutely phenomenal using that idea. So I think that the elements that you shared are really important, and I'm a huge advocate for sports as well, or some sort of physicality, because there's so much information that can't be explained to the logical mind when you push your body, whether it's running, whether it's sport, whether it's you can even do it with music, but there's not as much physicality there. It's another way. Music and art, I think, is also important, but the physicality for me as well, it's what I've learned most about myself, what I'm capable of, my connection with myself, and the understanding of the universe in the simulation. Because even from a science and physics level, which you know astronomically more than me, we get to a point where we know so little of what is actually happening, that there is such a bigger force in mind. And if we can learn to tune in to whatever that force is, we're probably going to have a more enjoyable life experience. So my question back to you is either to comment on that, or just talk about like your important tips for human optimization, living a good life. The strategies for, creating an idea, a compelling idea, and moving towards a life where people are really fulfilled. Because when somebody's sick, they're like, first of all, I need to be healthy. Once I'm healthy, then I can kind of redirect my life. So maybe you could speak on both, or the original question was just really, if someone is looking to create a magical life experience, combining the Eastern philosophies of contentment and peace and awareness with the potential and the inspiration to grow towards meaning, fulfillment, and contribution in the world, what have you seen or what information do you have to help and support a person to move in that direction?
Sure. I really like to go down the science avenue, and real science, not scientism that I had to learn in school. A little comment about McGregor, people like that, non-athletes would look at him as just a pretentious, brash sort of personality. But you have to understand, especially at the level that he's playing and at high levels of athletics, what he's doing, and you would understand this yourself with your involvement in sports, you're sticking your neck out deliberately. You're putting the pressure on yourself deliberately so that you have to put up. And anybody that operates on that level or any level of sport, whether you're out there bragging about it or not, you're putting it on the line and just brave enough to, dare to fail, so to speak. And I really respect that. And so when I hear a guy like him, he doesn't put me off in the least. I get it. I get where he's coming from. I get what he's really trying to do. And I respect that very much. So my biggest passion at this point in my life, besides farming, which, we have the farm here and, grow medicinal herbs and things. And most of the time I have my hands in the dirt these days. But real science, I think, we're absolutely ready for it. Because real science can be understood by a fourth grader. In fact, I would even suggest we'd all be better off quitting school after the fourth grade. Once we get our basic reading and writing skills down, school from that point on really can be a detriment, because to learn the truth from that point on, it requires more unlearning than learning the further we go on in school. And that's why a lot of our most learned, credentialed people become really the guardians or the keepers of the gate for the status quo, because they've got a lot invested. And even though a lot of the, like in science, when you're in physics, you learn the laws of thermodynamics and gravity and all these sorts of things that are incongruous and contradict each other all the time. I mean, just gravity alone is disprovable, and the way they come up, we have formulas. The product of the mass is inversely proportional to the distance, and all these things to explain gravity, which all has to do with physical mass and that sort of thing. And then later on they go, oops, there's not enough physical mass to explain how gravity keeps all the things in the solar systems going. So therefore there must be more mass somewhere. So let's call it dark matter we can't see it or verify it, but it must be there. So they just keep, and now they can stay in the same narrative to explain their theory of gravity. And they do this with everything. They just keep coming up with new theories that are out of thin air, that contradict, their own basic laws of physics, so that they don't have to change the narrative. And then you had these learned people from MIT and all these places that go along with it. And what's curious about that to me is I look at these people and I say, wow, these are smart guys, smart people. They really went through a lot and had high IQs of a certain level to get to the point in life where they're at and all their achievements. How can they not just see that it's illogical what they're saying? And a lot of what they're saying is disprovable, has been debugged. So real science can be understood at a very young age that would help us to, by the time we're adults, be able to be very self-sufficient and not need doctors, not need experts to tell us what to do. In fact, we would have the critical thought attributes that would give us an amazing BS meter that, maybe we haven't been trained in something like medicine, but when a medical expert says certain things, you would just say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't pass the muster of just old, traditional logic. And there are systems of logic that, I got to tail end of the old school kind of school. I didn't go to public schools. I prepped and, went to good colleges and that sort of thing. So I got the last part of that training where you're taught, classic trivium, quadrivium, logic, and those sorts of things. And your emphasis was on critical thought rather than memorizing factoids. And so I think we need to get back to that. But going back to people like Walter Russell, when you study his cosmogony of the universe, it's very understandable, but the only difficulty is you have to unlearn everything you thought to be true. So to answer your question, hopefully, I believe that if we had the right information, then it would dispel a lot of the things that create the cognitive dissonance that we all experience when we actually hear the truth intuitively or hear the truth through an alternative teacher, whether it's physics, medicine, engineering, farming, it doesn't matter. And then our mind wouldn't be triggering these old engrams that have been implanted very deeply at a young age, but then even more detrimentally, had them linked to emotional responses, which are usually reptilian hindbrain responses, so that we hear the truth, and for a split second, you say, well, that might sound logical, but then all of a sudden the dissonance sets in when the built-in trigger mechanism, and by the way, this is devised very cleverly and purposeful, but that's a different story. Those trigger mechanisms then go off that disallow you to just say, yeah, that makes sense, I'm going to investigate this further, but instead you just turn off the messenger or marginalize or demonize the messenger, even worse. So I believe that if we were exposed to this information, then we could apply it. We could start to then hear the truth, start to, and then, pragmatically apply that truth in our own lives, have our own experience. And then when that information becomes experience, that's what you call knowing. Like in the internal arts, you know that when you enter certain spaces, that things like time and space you do get good glimpses that happen more and more the more you practice, where you see through the cracks. Now, you can't explain that to somebody else. You can't teach them that. You can only give them information, and then they have to put it to practice. But the information, even though it's on the intellectual level, I think that's where we need to start. And it starts in our schools, which of course are avoiding those kinds of teachings like the plague. So I think the more people like yourself that are creating, like the wonderful platform that you've created, and getting out and allowing dialogues like this to take place. And there's a great awakening happening. And by the way, the great awakening, you can understand on a larger scale of waveform mechanics, as far as how planetary-wise we are going through different cycles. And this particular cycle, which can also explain how one element in the earth transitions to another element, will also explain how the earth itself is jumping octaves as we speak, which is allowing our species to be subjected to, lack of a better term, cosmic influences. And this isn't new agey stuff, this is real physics, that are awakening us. And the cat's out of the bag, which is why there's so much effort to censor and that sort of thing these days, but it can't be stopped. And so that's also why people like yourself are out initiating these types of dialogues, because people right now are thirsting for it. And we are right now entering, whether we realize it or not, the age of transmutation. And transmutation starts with each one of us individually, where when we understand the nature of our own thought processes and how they very mechanically create our reality, the more we understand that and apply those principles and experience results, then not only will that be empowering, but that will create a collective shift that will initiate the critical mass that we're just about, a hair away from right now, where everybody is going to wake up someday, and the average people that you wouldn't even suspect that would entertain such notions are going to say, well, yeah, sure, that makes sense. So go ahead.
Yeah, man. Well, I definitely agree with all that. And I love how you talk about, well, all of that, but the Great Awakening. I hear that word so often, and it's so great to hear you talk about it from a physics perspective and talk about the cosmic influence. I think there's so much to touch on there because, education for me was a real challenging one because I was resistant to education when I was a kid. And then I started to study persuasion and hypnosis and consciousness and manipulation. And I realized that our education system basically is designed to, like, for you to follow authority. There's all these subtle things in there, and you tied it into emotion, which is another element. It's like once that's seeded in there, there's a great quote that says, I think it's like Socrates or someone like that, but he says, give me the boy until he's 8 and I'll show you the man. And you look at our education system and our set of beliefs, once they're imprinted around 15, it's really hard, even younger, it's really hard for people to just change and understand from the neurology and their belief systems. They're more they want to try and keep their belief systems and build on that evidence rather than look at new evidence. Like they just want to compound what they already believe rather than be open to a new belief system, something different, something that might challenge what they already know, because it would be very hard. That's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. It would be very hard, and it would take a lot of courage for you to get a new piece of information that shattered your world, that made you rethink something around your core beliefs. And it's too possibly emotionally, physically traumatic for them to want to go through that. And it's a bummer that our system is set up this way. And it has a lot to do with money. They talk about science and science departments and universities and all these different things. If you would go against science, and there's so many great scientists, and I love that you're bringing up Walter Russell. His work is so important. And David Bohm as well came up on the podcast before. And these are two people that, I don't really have a science background, but I know about them because the great minds that I respect now respected those people, and they took a lot of information from their work. And a lot of these people had to really go against the grain and have the courage to put it out there. And the final thing that I'll say that I like that you ended with was that the awakening has to come from you. It has to come from the individual first, and then it can seed out to the collective. So the question that I had for you was, when you talk about awakening, what does that mean for you? And is there a set belief that people have? I'm trying to deduce this from the before and after. So, one of them for me is that an awakened person they stop. Their main goal isn't anymore, what can I get? It's more, what can I give? You need to get certain things, but they're thinking about contribution. They're aware of their impact on their community and the world. They realize that they are infinite. They're probably not going to die. It's not mandatory, but you've had these spaces doing the inner martial arts and things like that, where you have a very visceral experience that you are connected to everything, and your spirit or whatever that is going to go on. You don't really fear death in the way that you may have before. I think an awakened person also has the ability to be humble and question their beliefs into, understand something. I learned something called the formula for truth. Shout out Corey Herder, long time ago. And it was basically when someone is saying something to you that you don't believe. Let's say you believe the earth is round and then there's a flat earther. And I actually applied this versus a flat earth debate once, and I learned so much. But the idea was I didn't resist flat earth. I don't really know 100% if it's round or if it's flat. I've heard the science on both, but I'm not educated enough to go test it myself or look at it myself. So anyway, they're telling me about the flat earth, and I just listened. I asked a few questions, and I listened. And what happened is, if you imagine, a 0 to 90 degree scale, and they're at flat earth and you're at round earth, when you listen and you seek understanding, you're going to find a nugget of information over there rather than defending your point. It doesn't mean that you need to believe what they believe, and I don't believe in flat earth. They didn't convince me, but I was like, that's a very compelling argument. But all of the different ways my mind began to think, I had new ideas, I had different perceptions that I had never experienced before. I had, that was increasing my consciousness through seeking understanding rather than seeking being correct. So those are a few of them for me, and I'm just curious if you could speak about some of those belief systems that you think change for an awakened human and an awakened species, and maybe even some of the physics of the cosmic influence and anything else you want to throw in there.
Okay. No problem.
Not a little one.
So first off, I would never consider myself awake, whatever that means to different people. One thing I can say is that I know I'm asleep. And I think when you can say that, you're over the hump, because that's a great level of awareness that when we realize that, oh, we're really not getting reported back to us through our senses what we think we're experiencing. And I default back to the physics again, and people like Walter Russell, if you really understand waveform mechanics, you understand a thought-based universe where nothing else can possibly exist except for the compression, decentralization cycle of creation. There's two sides. It's like a hydraulic pump that happens simultaneously. One voids each other out every single moment to create the next frame of our existence. And then that stratification on the compression side creates, our sense of time and all those other things. So when you understand those mechanics, then you would also appreciate that your senses that you take so seriously, including the extensions of the technological extensions of our senses, like microscopes and so forth, chemical assays, are still our senses and still an idea in the simulation. And all they can do is simulate and nuance through electrical polarities, waveforms. In other words, they give body to your idea. And the whole object, of course, of the experience for the level of the soul is to have a very vivid and rich feedback mechanism that is going to allow you to understand the symmetry or asymmetry of your thoughts, your beliefs, that are given birth in the simulation by the velocity of your emotions, because the emotions will also create not only the ability to pop into the matrix, if you want to use that, and but also play with the geometric forces and polarities to help you understand if you're operating on the original patterns and principles provided by nature. I'm very fortunate. I live here. I'm looking out at a beautiful nature here out my window. We're at least 20 miles away from the closest power line. I'm talking to you today by satellite. We turn our modems off when we don't need computer access. So, no cell service. So, you aren't subjected to those overlays all the time that prevent you from just naturally repatterning with nature. And so, and we live out here for a reason, not to try to escape the real world, but it's just a very pleasant place to be. And the computer world allows us to do our business and talk to people all over the world every day and still, live this way. So we have to understand how things work, including what our sensory apparatus really is. And then we won't take it as seriously. So then going back to your internal practices, you realize that, as Walter Russell would explain, you are the fulcrum rather than the two ends of the seesaw that are constantly trying to seek balance with each other. You know, the two polarities, the yin yang, the Asian medicine, they talked all about all of this metaphorically. And, you know, after the fact now, I realize what they were really talking about was tonal fields. You know, if you were to talk about the elements and the other metaphors they used as far as the energies that they applied for medicine and just in their philosophy, you know, earth, water, you know, water is the keynote of D, earth is F sharp, and, you know, their actual tonal fields. So, and in fact, Sean Han Lun, if you go back to some of the original writings and translations, you realize, oh, these guys really got it. So when, and I do this to this day when I'm doing a formulation with herbs and whatnot. I like to understand that like C-60 is 700 times stronger antioxidant, you know, than say vitamin C and all the things, you know, to round back to your question a long time ago of things that researchers found out about C-60. But what I really understand, it's about the energetics, you know, what are these herbs representing, what archetypes, and what analogs are of, you know, particular cells that comprise different organ systems. And so how can I use those to effectively treat or create a formulation that's going to work on a waveform mechanics perspective, what Oriental medicine used to consider energetics, and then also provide balance rather than just robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is what a lot of these nutraceuticals do these days. So, you know, you made some other, and forgive me, I'm going all over the place again. You mentioned authority, which is an interesting concept. Because again, when you go back to an understanding of real physics, you understand that there's no such thing as an external authority. There's no such thing. It can't be. And any institution or group of people that claim authority, you know, because they write words on a piece of paper and they say this gives us the right to use violence or take things from other groups of people, it's really kind of ludicrous when you understand you as the creator of your own universe and your entire reality is comprised of your own thoughts given body by your desire. How can somebody external to your universe jump in the mix of things and create in your little area? It's impossible. Of course, if we've been systematically hijacked on the mental plane, which is the situation we find ourselves in, and we believe that people actually have that authority, then we are going to create their reality. So you always have to go back to how the creative process actually works. Then, you know, I went down a lot of rabbit holes, including legal processes, and even had some fun adventures with agencies and things as I challenged them and presented them with paperwork, because I just had to test it. You know, I didn't want to, you know, be a troublemaker. Well, maybe I did a little bit, but, you know, I just wanted to see how things work. So we'd actually go in their system and even the courts and these sorts of things. And, you know, I learned the paper game and how things are done and that whole thing. And like anything, when you learn you've been deceived, you go through predictable emotional cyclic changes from discouragement to anger to resentment. And, you know, but then you come out the other end, hopefully, and say, okay, it was an experience. I got what I needed. I don't have to resist anybody because they've got me just as much as when I was ignorant of their whole deception in the first place. And so, you know, it's a good learning, but then you have to kind of leave that behind, because if you're in that struggle, you know, of resistance or anger at the bad guys, it's impossible for you to become the fulcrum, which is that stillness that allows you to manipulate the polarities in order to create the symmetry to outpicture what you want to see in your life and what you want to see in the world at large. And the greatest ploy of all is to keep us in the polarities, this side against that side, and divide and conquer. And that's why I don't get involved in a political process or any of that sort of thing. And it's not, a lot of people will say, well, God, you don't vote, don't you care, and that sort of thing. It's like, well, no, we actually care deeply. That's why we really want to understand that true change will only happen when we become the master of our own polarities and, by example, plant seeds in other people that are ready for it. And of course, at the soul level, there are many people right now that aren't even aware in the outer that they are very ready to move on and get off of this polarity consciousness. And it's just a matter of enough people creating enough of a drafting experience that they can fall in behind, and we're all playing follow the leader in a way. I was fortunate that in my early years, I was taken under the wing of some very special people that were icons from Europe. The most renowned teachers of Rudolf Steiner's work, musicology from famous composers from Germany, and medical icons from the old school that, before the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, they used Western developments in science to augment what had gone on for centuries before. And these great minds at that time, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, if they were left on their own and people had free access to all their inventions and teachings and examples, we would have already been experiencing a renaissance at this point. Now that you wouldn't recognize the world compared to what it is now. So I was fortunate; I got the tail end of that, and I drafted them, and now we just keep paying it forward. And there's a reason why old cultural norms of revering your elders and understanding that experience is very important, and for the youngsters to kind of respect that and learn. Now we have most of the elders are off in rest homes muttering to themselves or watching television on drugs, pharmaceuticals and all that sort of thing. So, but that's all choice, and we need to have empathy and try to help those people. But more important, we just need to get our message out, realize this is the time, realize there are higher intelligences that have our back, and that it's inevitable that things are going to change as soon as we, dare to get out there and be an example of ourselves, of these principles. So please go ahead, jump in there.
Yeah, well,
I could go off in a lot of different directions, but I think I'm meandering a little bit.
I totally agree, and I was actually looking up a couple quotes when you're speaking there that I think that are relevant. The first one is by Buckminster Fuller, and it says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And the other one that came to my mind, my friend Bruce shared it with me this weekend. We were doing a teaching with a Native American elder friend of mine who has a 20,000-year oral history, and this includes his elders teaching him about physics, math, engineering, put balloons in outer space for frig's sakes, and is sharing similar things to what you're voicing here. And when we talk about history and I'm trying to relate to him, his history is so different. He's just like, what you're sharing with me is like a blip. It's like, mine's 20,000 years. This is you trying to share with me what you understand of 200 years. So it might be a little bit mind-blowing for you. And a lot of it is very, very mind-blowing. But one of the quotes that Bruce shared this weekend was, we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us, even in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it's far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do, to affect the quality of the day. That is the highest of arts. And that's Henry David Thoreau. And when he read that, I was like, that's such that guy knew how to write. That is some good stuff there. And it talks about when you're talking about the balance, and that's what it made me think about.
There have been so many amazing people in the history of our planet. And if we could just listen to what they said and also look at their lives and what they created. For instance, people always remarked about Walter Russell and asked him, and all the greats of his time, your Mark Twains and Teslas and Edisons, they in royalty in Europe, they all wanted to be around him. And isn't it interesting that we've never heard of him? At least most people haven't. And then Tesla, of course, people know that name a little bit, but then they link it to an electric car or something, But if we just listen to these people, everything we're talking about today is no secret. It's the oldest stuff that's been under our noses from all time. Even more of a conventional scientist like Einstein even said, you can't fix. I think he's the one that this quote comes from. He said, you can't fix something from the same box that the problem was created. And when you understand waveform mechanics, you understand our entire simulation is the box. And the only possible way we can create from outside the box is, again, to enter that stillness, become the fulcrum, and then become more masterful, just like any artistic endeavor, and painting exactly what you want with the paintbrushes of the two polarities. And we could go into such fantastic detail as far as how that actually outpictures with the electrical forces. It would explain that, yes, there is a higher intelligence in the universe, and things didn't just explode one day and create all the laws of natural laws and everything in one single instant as a grand oops. There is, an omniscient, omnipresent intelligence. We are coordinates within that unified force field, if you want to talk about it, as part of the larger mind, not in a Borg sense, but in having the ability to individualize and create as we wish, as long as we obey natural principles, and not that disobedience is good or bad. It's just that will create havoc and interfere with the processes of other sentient beings. So it's just really not a nice thing to do. So we have the ability to create as we wish, but you can't do it from inside the simulation, which is why there have been great efforts for centuries to hypnotically make us believe that we are the simulation rather than the, like saying we are the painting rather than Leonardo out here actually doing the creation. You can't find Leonardo in the painting, just like you can't find your mind, your sentience within your bank account, within the flesh of what you think of as your body. It doesn't reside there. And when you get a glimpse of that, of course, you really do lose the fear of death, because you understand that, oh, I am eternal and these cycles come and go. And Walter's cosmogony also explained how reincarnation, which happens to be what most of the world believes in the first place, really is how things work. And it also explains how when we really have our wits about us, we can take one particular cycle. And this is what we have unique to humanity versus the animal kingdom, is we have the ability to maintain a polarity, to maintain a north, south, east, west symmetry by proper emotion and thought, to the point where while we're still in the simulation, we can jump to the next octave. And, that gets into some other belief systems that'll step on a lot of toes. But if we believe that our whole soul purpose here is to be like, an apple tree I'm looking at out in my orchard here, that comes and goes with the seasons and dies every fall and grows new leaves and fruit the next year, and that's just the whole of our experience, well, that would be, really kind of a finite, non-purposeful existence. And obviously we're here to gather enough steam so that we can take ourselves out of quarantine, so to speak, and trust ourselves to be masterful enough to create in pure regions of consciousness and, really let it rip and, have a good time like we're supposed to. There was nothing, I believe, that was ever part of the original plan that this was supposed to be the school of hard knocks. And so, again, what we need to do is start teaching real science so that the heart and the mind can be unified and that humanity can realize its next cycle of experience, which is inevitable, and it's going to happen with or without us. Whether we have to go kicking or screaming or just go along as willingly as a participant in a grand adventure, which is, as crazy as things are out in the world these days, I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world. This right now is a real pivotal time on the planet. And so, yeah, that's why these dialogues, I think, are important, just to start looking at things from an entirely different perspective and to just dispel the superstitions so that we can get on with things.
Yeah. Well, I 100% agree on that. And you were speaking about, I think, higher civilizations and influences and keywords that I'm definitely aware of. So I think you're in that bush that I like to go in, because I like to explore the idea of just everything. What are the limits of consciousness? What's the limit of reality? What's the purpose of life? What's happening here? And the biggest questions we can ask ourselves. And I think that we are living in some of the most exciting times in history. This is a very interesting time. It's a very pivotal time. And this is a time when you matter. If you're alive, you matter now. You are very important to what happens as a whole. You're influencing yourself, your community, and the entire world through, whether you want to call it butterfly effect or whatever. I think that every human being here matters. And it's challenging because a lot of people are going through a rough time, and a lot of people are frustrated, and a lot of people are suffering in many different ways, and it can be challenging. I would love to dive deep with you on all these things. So I think we're going to have to do another podcast because we've been going for quite a bit. And what I want to ask you, and I'm going to throw a whole bunch of things your way, and feel free to give a good rant on it. But what's your view on the higher intelligences? What do you mean when you say that? Like, is it your view that there are different species here, or we're in connection with some sort of higher intelligence? Are you familiar with the zoo theory?
I don't think so.
It's a theory about extraterrestrial life that I was told to research by my Native American friend, and it basically said that if there was a higher intelligence viewing, Earth, that it would just be, you have to let them be in their own environment, basically like Star Trek rules. Like, you don't want to influence that situation that's happening, that they're just kind of observing and watching, but not wanting to influence too much, kind of similar to maybe what you were saying before, that it's just like because it's like the Fermi paradox, right? Why are there so many, we know of so many planets that what was I listening to? I was listening to I think it was Chariots of the Gods, and in that book he just does an estimation. They do a scientific estimation with Carl Sagan and a bunch of other scientists and physicists, and they do a low number of planets that could have intelligent life, and intelligent life that's beyond ours, and that number is huge just within our solar system, let alone outside our solar system. So, and if you look at ancient civilizations and you do that kind of research, it really does require a new way of thinking about history. It's a lot older than we think. Modern science says it's 6,000 years, I think, is like civilization, the first like primitive man. But we now, Graham Hancock was talking about the Denisova cave and all these other artifacts and all this. Graham Hancock has just such a great library of information to research on your own, where we're getting proof that our civilization is older. And he's getting it from other scientists, but he's the one who's kind of popularizing it and bringing it to the forefront. So that requires a whole new model of the planet. So I'll give it back to you to share your views on any of that. And we'll just start with that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, there's amazing like Hancock and archaeologists and especially in Russia, there's been a lot of historians that have even pretty much laid out a good case that our whole history has been manipulated, and entire historical cycles that didn't even exist were thrown in, and the whole time cycle has been manipulated. There's a whole time clock that is manipulated to take us out of our natural cycles. When you're talking about extraterrestrials or life on other planets, the first thing I think we need to look at more seriously is that when we're inspecting through our present level of science and extrapolating through those findings what might be elsewhere, we're still doing it within a sense consciousness and technologies that are extensions of that. So it's really not going to give you a true understanding of other life forms that are alive and well everywhere in the universe that are operating in a different octave. Now, people typically talk about it as far as dimensions. I'd say, going at it in a little more of a systematic way, if you think of it as octaves. So if you're operating, say, on an octave beyond the fifth, where we presently are, and you're trying to discern things with fifth octave technologies, they aren't going to show up. You don't have the equipment to even go there. Earlier you were talking about flat Earth versus globe heads. I don't get involved in that one either. I'm not a flat earther, but I think they bring up some very interesting points. And one thing I wholeheartedly agree with them is everything we've learned from NASA is all cartoons. And that's very demonstrable. So they've got that right. And then they kind of jump to some conclusions that are a little, I might not agree with. But then, the conventional system of, what we would think of as far as the heliocentric model of the universe. Well, when you understand waveform mechanics, you're going to understand solar systems and planetary bodies in terms of pressure zones, which would also explain gravity. It would also explain how things are maintained in space, even though there's no space. If you understand the life cycle or the creative cycle, every body is simultaneously in its expanded decentralized version. At the same time, it's in its smaller compressed data cycle where, it registers to our senses and our technologies. So areas that we call space are just the more the decentralized dispersion of data that is existing all the time. So there's no such thing as space. But when you understand how all these forces are working, you would also you could come up with some good educated guesses as far as the intelligence, not only behind those, but also residing in those different octaves right now as we speak. Now, just going back to what we can verify on this planet within the simulation, a lot of those brilliant scientists have proven that, no, there's been civilizations on this planet for a long time. And humanity, I believe, from what I've seen, has been here in a very conscious, high conscious state for over 4 million years. And what we consider our history is a little flash in the pan that's also been greatly manipulated, so we don't even know that little slice accurately, in order to make us think that we're much less than what we really are. So we've really devolved in a way. But when you look at the larger cycles, you see that when certain cycles are completing, you also necessarily have what we think of as our problems kind of come to the surface and become more evident. So a lot of times that's actually evidence that things are getting better. For instance, when I was in my clinical years and we get these people that were given a death sentence, and then we do our bioterrain medicine and all that sort of thing that we haven't talked about today, you would literally manipulate those things to the surface. And any good homeopathic knows that it's a process of driving things to the surface so it can be expelled once and for all. And that happens on many levels. So when people were in fact getting better, for a while, if you didn't have experience in the technical know-how to manage a clinical case so that people wouldn't succumb during those critical times, you'd swear that things were getting worse. But a seasoned practitioner would say, no, that's just par for the course. And then sure enough, most of the time they come out the other end. So we're seeing that on a grander scale right now. All the things that look like we're, going downhill real quick are actually just all our ills being driven to the surface, because that is part of the process that's being provoked by the larger cycles. So a lot of what really changed me early on, and this is kind of personal, and I even hesitate to go here, but early on, right after I was through with my conventional training in medicine and right in between there and Naturopathic College, I was already, more than dabbling in martial arts and things. So I was, trying to jump into that world. But one of my early teachers was from an indigenous culture, and he grew up old school, where they were chosen at birth. Like my vocation, and this time around, it's not who I am. It's just my vocation. I spent a lot of time in is medicine, and that was his vocation too. But in their culture, they were recognized by the by the elders, you know, that were in that field as, oh, this soul, this is what they came in to do. And if you understand how they were able to do that, it would make perfect sense, and it wouldn't seem metaphysical or woo-woo in the slightest. So he was in his 90s in the last year of his life, and I spent a good deal of time with him in that final year. And he was in good health and everything, but you know, before he went, he just 2 weeks prior just said, "Okay, I'm out of here," and then he did in fact leave. But during that time period with them, I did have experiences that forever made me reevaluate what I thought was real. And initially, some of those experiences were actually a little disturbing. And, because your ego has a tough time when you kind of realize that some of the things that you thought were of import or things that were who you are aren't necessarily true. So right then you start a very definite process of ego death, which is why not everybody embraces a lot of what we're talking about today, because it can be uncomfortable, it can be disturbing. But I did have that experience, and he also did do some regression with me where I was able to experience some different times and places. We'll just leave it at that. So then when you have an experience such that, and this isn't a special experience, I have talked to so many people that have had similar experiences. So what I'm talking about is not pretending to have anything special, or it's actually should be a normal experience. And the only reason why everybody doesn't have such encounters or adventures like that is because, on some level, they're maybe just a little bit resistant. And but I think a lot of people are seeking that these days. They're seeking it through psychedelics, try to address that little thing with ayahuasca and different psychedelics, microdosing with psilocybin. I'm not at all against that. And I really believe that done properly, those things can be of value, tremendous value, but it's a double-edged sword, because if you overstay your welcome or even think that that's the path to enlightenment, then you're back in the same old box again. So, and what I see going on a lot in those circles is, oh, that is going to enlighten me, rather than just saying, well, maybe, my inner voice is saying that would be a good little measure to kind of have a neurological reset and then move on and not overstay my welcome. Then, that's for up to every individual to decide. But we all get our own experiences, and whichever way they come for whatever we're ready for. And I'll finish with that.
Yeah, well, that's a really grounded perspective on the psychedelics, because it's come up a lot in my podcast and in my life. I've gone that way. And there's a quote by, I don't know if it's Alan Watts or somebody, but he's just like, psychedelics are like knocking on the door. Like once it's answered, you don't need to keep knocking. And so, respect, and it's not the be all and end all. It's an experience that can help shift you or inspire you or give you a piece of information to continue the journey, continue like the consciousness of everyday experience. Like that should be the consciousness we're seeking, because it's so magical and wonderful. We just kind of forgot, and we got really serious, and we're skewing our own perspective, and it can be challenging. But I hope that those experiences are reminders that, hey, you do have a connection to something greater than you. You do have the ability to influence your life to a great degree, to create a life that you're proud of. And it's going to take some work. It's not an overnight process. There's going to be trials and tribulations and failures, and that's a part of it. There's no skipping steps, and nobody gets to skip those. And you also have that really direct connection with spirit. That's something greater, whatever you want to call it. And I'm glad that you shared the experience with the indigenous, because one of my main teachers, I talked about him a couple of times. I talk about him all the time on the podcast. David Lombear Senepas is a Mi'kmaq elder, and he's told I've experienced some really out there stuff with him. I've shared it on the podcast before. It was like after we had our first podcast, episode 53, I called him on the phone and I asked him, I said, hey, is what you're saying to me true? Or are you a Native American storyteller saying things so we're kind and compassionate to each other, because these are great stories? It's like, I am a storyteller, but the ones that I told you, you can ask me for sure if you missed it, but those experiences happened. I was 26 years on a mountain. I was taught by elders, all these things. And I was like, whoa. And he's like, I could bring you in a tunnel to where I am right now. And I was like, what? And he's just like, do you need me to? And I was like, I thought it was kind of like spiritual candy or something, where like, if I didn't have faith, I couldn't go. So I was like, you don't have to, but it'd be really cool if you did. And so he goes, okay, look at the sky tonight. You may or may not see something. And I was at Arco Santi, this sustainable village in Arizona. I was at a lower level, and it was like pizza night for like the a lot of people that live there. And I forgot about it. Then I start walking up to where I'm staying, and there's a star super bright about 50 feet above Arco Santi. My friend has a drone, so I was like, you got to give reality a chance, but this thing's super weird. I run up the hill, I go to the right, I follow it with my eyes the whole time, goes across the road, and it's brighter than the North Star, and it's just across the road, and it's pretty low. And I'm looking at it, and I was like, what the heck is this? And so then with all my infinite wisdom, I decide to ohm and bring it closer, because that's how you communicate with something you don't understand. And starts getting closer and closer and closer, and probably 50 feet away, if that, 50 feet in the air, if that, it looked, I actually have one of his original drawings, and it's a triangle with these waves around it, and he calls it we're all connected through strands of light. And so, or the Freemason symbol, if you look at the Freemason drawing that they have, and it's really thin lines, that's what it looked like. But it also would shift to what looked like Star Trek. That symbol that they wear on the symbol that they wear, it kind of would shift into that shape, and it was this pulsing orb, and I was close enough to see it, and I have it on film. You can look up UFO orb at Arco Santi. It's on my YouTube. It's a crappy video because it's night, but I stared at this thing for 40 minutes. When it was that close, I got afraid. It backed up, and then it got closer, and then after 40 minutes, I was kind of bored, so I figured I'll try to meditate and communicate with the thing. And I tried 3 times, and the last time that I looked back, this star, this orb, whatever it was, just disappeared. And I call him up the next day, and I was like, did you have anything to do with that? And he's like, maybe. They never. And I also read a book called Mad Bear, and it talks about a man following a Native American and some of the mystical things that happen, but he would never glorify it. He'd never talk about it. Just every now and then, through being around, something wild would happen. And the last story I'll share is going down to Guatemala to the Mayan fire ceremony with the Mayan elders. And I've had Carlos Barrios on my podcast several times. And I went down there to visit him, to meet him in person, to get some teachings, to learn more. And he shared one of the stories when he was younger, going to, I think he was in Egypt, and I can't remember why, but he was invited somewhere with the Sufis with their spinning circles. And he said that he was in this room and he was observing them do the circles. And then a few minutes in, they were 3 feet off the ground. And I was like, what? And he goes, that's the face I made, but bigger. And so that's when I realized that my teachings that I was getting glimpses of in the Mayan culture were real, that there was validity to this, and that was the path that he was on to wanting to experience those things. So, and again, like you said, it's not to be something mystical and magical, which it is when you think about it and you experience it, but the more you understand it, there's actually a scientific principle behind it. And just like in Star Trek, it'll talk about, if a civilization comes to Earth with technology that's so far advanced, they're going to think that they're gods or it's mystical. They just don't have the scientific understanding of it. And from my knowledge of studying with the elders, doing my own practices, talking with physicists and everything in between, that there is some sort of scientific principle to the paranormal that we are just not aware of now, and we're just in a veil of either ignorance or not understanding. So I just wanted to share all that, and if you wanted to share one of your stories, not to press, you can. And if you want to just end it with anything that you wish that I had asked, that you'd want to talk about, but I just appreciate everything that you shared, your experiences, your knowledge, your intention, and for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a delightful conversation. I've enjoyed every moment of it. I'd say the only thing I could add to that is, rather than talking about phenomena, and, people always want to know, well, what have you experienced, and can you do this? And that's really not the point. And those are, great questions, and they can be fun discussions. But the point is really helping us understand that there's no such thing as special people, more evolved people. It's only what we're ready for. And I'd say our language is very important, because the way we embody our thoughts in this plane most powerfully is with sound. And words have great import in that they articulate sounds in very precise ways that involve mathematical sequences. They involve belief systems, emotions, and everything in those sounds. And if we understand how powerful words are, we'd really start cleaning up, I think, our language, starting with spiritual, because the word spiritual really connotes that, okay, now there's something that's not spiritual or non-spiritual. And so when people say, well, I'm having a spiritual experience, or I'm on a spiritual path, I would just ask, well, what isn't spiritual? Everything we experience is from the same origin, and that same origin is simply refracting electrical forces in a myriad of dimensions on every waveform to nuance into very precise locations and adventures and phenomena and appearances of not only matter but motion. So if we understand that that is all a product of us and our creative abilities, then we would once and for all end this schizophrenia that we're all suffering from, that there's spiritual, non-spiritual, where I'm going to my job today, I'm going to church today, so today's a spiritual day, yesterday was something different. And I think that's what's happened to all of us now, is we're extremely schizophrenic. And in the world of science, rather than going back to the origin, which is us, and understanding that we have a lot to say about our experience, we're instead delegating all of our inspection to the world of effects. And then when we try to fix problems from the after effects of those forces, those primal forces that we put in motion in the first place, and try to come up with solutions, what we're endeavoring to do is, through minutia that we can't even see the relationships between in the first place, trying to re-engineer our way back up to some point where we're going to somehow fix things. It's not going to happen. So examining the world of effects is a lot of fun, and I enjoy that. That's why I like to engage in medicine and science and that sort of thing. But if you don't understand where things come, and us as a progenitor of everything, and our free will, and just the privilege of creation in the first place, that allows us to have this experience, we're never going to get anywhere, because you're back in the same box. And so science, medicine, when we finally get to the point of merging what used to be considered metaphysics and study the people that were the missing link that now allow old school metaphysics to become real physics, and that also teach us to operate as a whole. It's very trendy today to use the term holistic. And, you know, while we're using that term, we're still got a great chasm between the intellect and the heart, and not really coalescing the two so they operate as one unit that would allow us to be masterful in our creations, not create further havoc and suffering in the world, and you know, have a lot more fun while we're at it. And in addition to the scientists out there that really get into the physics and the mechanics of things, there's just wonderful people these days that are living examples of people just that are passionate about life, sharing their experience with the world. You know, people, I love people like Wim Hof, you know, who's just this guy that's out there leading the charge. And, he's really not coming from ego. He's just having a great time, and he's discovered some things, and he's sharing them. And just when you're around people like that, just their enthusiasm, their joy for life, their unconditional love for their fellow humans is really catching. And we need more of that. We need to get out of our minds, get our feet and our hands back in the dirt. Like Wim Hof says, I've got a great swimming hole down there that comes out of pure bedrock, and even in the middle of the hot summer, it's ice cold. So I do my breathing exercises and jump in and stay in the frigid water, and you come out, you're exhilarated, and I have people like that to thank that kind of led the way and said, hey, here's a technique I have developed and through my own experience, and then I subjected my own body to scientific scrutiny, and this is what they found that's happening on the cellular level. And we live in a wonderful, wonderful time. And if we stop paying attention to what we think of as our problems, and that doesn't mean a Pollyanna approach where we ignore things or suppress things that are going on, but actually pay attention to what these other people are telling us, not only would we have a lot more fun, but in that would be the solution, and our problems would vanish very quickly. But that's what we need to do, is just get more people engaged in life rather than problems, and understanding who they really are and what their true purpose is in the first place.
Well, that's amazing. This whole show has been very fascinating, very deep, very thick on the science at parts, but also very practical. I think that your background and your experience and your history is all very valid, and it's all very important for people to understand that the views that you're coming to are through a lot of trial, error, study, science. And you're talking about very simple concepts that everybody can understand. Everybody that can listen, that has listened, can take those ideas today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for everything that you're doing. You have an incredible website with incredible products that I know that you make. You haven't talked about them at all, but you've done a lot of research on these to create them. So if people want to look at your work, what you're putting out there in the world, they want to dive deeper, where can they go to find out more?
Our website is alfavedic.com. It's alfavedic.com. And the products, they do represent, good products that we've created that people can use and benefit from. More importantly for us, they represent what we've learned along the way and what we'd like to share through those products. And also, they are part of a sustainable permaculture model. My wife and myself have overseen and started a permaculture guild in our area. We work with a Northwestern University and teach outreach programs in agriculture. We're teaching people of low income groups how to grow their own food and create their own food banks. And we provide the materials, the space, and the teaching to empower people in this way. And we have a working farm. And part of permaculture being self-sustainability and just sustainability for future generations, business should be part of that so that we don't have to seek government grants or outside revenues that would have strings attached or skew our original purpose in the first place or get us unnecessarily involved in somebody else's creation. So it allows us to have a pure permaculture model, not only in growing good nutrient-dense food, which is not what organic food does, by the way. That's another whole discussion we could have. But nutrient-dense food where you manage the soil according to its electrical properties so that you're fine-tuning the resistance levels in the micronage of the soil so that the roots will uptake things very efficiently without the need of even a lot of organic fertilizers, and also grow nutrient-dense food. That organic food, albeit cleaner and it's preferable, organic food is not nutrient-dense food that you're buying in the health food store these days. But more importantly, these practices are allowing us to actually build new topsoil for future generations, whereas large-scale organic farming is doing what conventional farming is doing, which is destroying topsoil, and we're about out of it. So that's our real passion these days. That's why we have a business arm that provides the revenue to sustain our whole operation and do all the things that, float our boat.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like we could cover a whole bunch more topics, especially around, the outreach and helping people create food and nutrient-dense food. That's definitely another topic as well. And organic. I'm aware of the fringes of all that, so I can understand that what you're doing is very, very important. So thank you for that element as well. Thanks for coming on the show. And did you say your website? Did I blank on that? What's your website?
I did, alfavedic.com.
Awesome. Okay, well, Dr. Bear, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure.
Matthew, thank you, and for everything you're doing. Awesome work.
I appreciate you, man. Well, thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.